Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, the museum's curator of collections. So last time we began our conversation with Katrina Navickas, Professor of History at the University of Hertfordshire, and we were talking about the history of the commons and the processes that governed and restricted access to those spaces and those resources.
I think it was significant that we spoke about the complexity of the commons because it just became so apparent in the chat with Katrina that actually it's much more complicated than just being freely shared and available to all. And
yeah, absolutely.
This time, we're continuing to talk about the history of the commons, but focusing much more on protest and activism against enclosure throughout the modern period.
So we'll be talking about raves, druids, golf courses, the complexity of access to space. And that still plays a key part in shaping our contemporary lives in England today.
We also chat about Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves.
Correct. Correct.
We do.
Yeah, we do.
We do.
Yeah, and within that, we touched on a really significant tree that's highlighted in that particular film. And it's a tree that was famously known as Sycamore Gap. It was a defining part of England's natural landscape. But what we didn't really get time to touch on in the episode was the tragedy of that tree's illegal felling in 2023. So it's probably a story that's quite well known to people here in the UK, but it might not be well known to others. The tree was tragically cut down. There has subsequently been an investigation. 2 people were arrested and prosecuted, and they're currently serving some time in jail for cutting the tree down. It was really sad, but it's a really positive story in some ways because the tree is still alive and it will take a long time to recover and turn into a different kind of tree, but also a whole load of really interesting projects spun off from that tragic moment. And other saplings have been grown from cuttings from the tree. And yeah, it's sort of proliferated in a way. There'll be lots of Sycamore Gap trees here, there and everywhere.
It felt like something that everyone agreed was a tragedy and a really terrible act.
Yeah, it's a kind of interesting thing, isn't it? Thinking about national symbols and things that bring us all together. There's that wonderful Tree of the Year scheme that runs every year, and it kind of brings people together. We like a good tree, don't we?
I think so. And actually, that's something that we do talk about with Katrina and much more about what England kind of means to us, what the traditional ideas of place and magic. We talk about kind of the myths of Merlin and things like that. And, you know, even though they're myths, they're very powerful myths that have defined a lot of how we think about the past. And that spills into the present. And that tree was a significant part of that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
Welcome back, Katrina. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
Great. Thank you.
So we're really excited to have Katrina Navickas back for another episode. We talked last time, Katrina, about the myth of the commons. We talked about the myth of enclosure, actually. Lots of myth breaking and myth busting. We also talked really about some of those definitions of how we come to think about landscapes and public space in the way that we do now. What we didn't talk quite so much about is the protest end of things. So I wonder whether you could give us a little bit of a summary of some of the ways in which people have pushed back against these movements to control space over the 18th and 19th centuries, bringing us through to maybe talking about the more recent shifts and changes in this space.
So we've talked a lot about enclosure and the commons and how that's reshaped the landscape in 19th century Britain. But actually, there was always popular resistance to enclosure in local communities who saw their landscape changing before their eyes, who saw the removal of their customary rights and removal of rights of way. From the very start, there were popular actions against enclosure. People would pull down fences, set fire to fences, and use traditional forms of protest that we see in rural society generally all the way through the 19th century. In the book, I've got a deep dive into what happened in Sheffield in 1791. The Duke of Norfolk encloses about 6,000 acres, I think, of the moorland surrounding Sheffield, again, mainly for industrial and building purposes. There's a lot of popular resistance, and people not only pull up the fences and set fire to things, they go round the houses of the people who were involved on the committee to enclose the moorland and break the windows and threaten them. Because it's at the very start of the French Revolution, the authorities think that the French are involved, trying to cause an uprising and a revolution amongst these Sheffield metalworkers. But there's actually very little evidence, even though political radicalism was strong in Sheffield quite early on during the French Revolution. There's very little evidence that the Sheffield radicals were involved. It seems to be mostly a popular reaction against the taking away of access to land, access to footpaths. It's quite an interesting incident where the vicar has been, again, we use this word improving. It's also used in an urban environment to mean what we now call regeneration, reshaping the streetscape of Sheffield. The vicar was involved in that, and people are reacting against this reshaping of their landscape. So there's popular reaction to enclosure all the way through. We do have the rise of footpath preservation societies in the 1820s, the rise of the commons preservation movement in the 1860s, which are more legal, peaceful forms of resistance. So they bring legal cases against landowners for stopping up of footpaths or for enclosure. But that's always accompanied by popular reaction. The Commons Preservation Society was formed in 1865 in response to mainly one incident, which was at Wimbledon. Earl Spencer wanted to enclose part of Wimbledon Common to build on, and the great and the good around Wimbledon, which was still quite a rural area but also quite a well-to-do area, formed a society and fought in the courts against Earl Spencer's decision to do that, and they won. And that spurred on the movement to fight more legal cases against the enclosure of the commons, particularly around this expanding metropolis. So we see much more localised resistance, but also legal cases in the London Commons at Hackney, Plumstead. There's a famous case in Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire where the local commoners and the local villagers again used direct action against the landowner who was trying to enclose. So these become these kind of key points in the history of the commons preservation movement. And they continue well into the 20th century. People always pulling up fences when they feel that their right of way has been stopped up.
I guess we're going to go on to talk a little bit about how police and law enforcement have responded to some of these moments of pushback and protest. There's a really famous example which crops up in your first book, Protest and the Politics of Space and Place, and crops up again here. It's kind of a significant cultural touchstone, and that's the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester. I wonder whether you could just give us a very brief summary of the Peterloo Massacre, just because I think it helps set the scene for so much of the sort of back and forth of how police and law enforcement have attempted to react and respond to these moments of pushback.
So Peterloo is a really important marker in the rise of the democratic movement in Britain, the fight for the vote. And it happened on St. Peter's Fields. Importantly, it was not quite a field, it was more like a building ground towards the south of Manchester city centre, which was still a relatively small area in 1819. It's also an era before the rise of the police force or the implementation of a national police force. The people in charge of law and order were generally magistrates who were gentry and vicars and the great and the good of local society who actually had very little resource to enforce against large crowds. So they had to call on the military. That's the only way you could really do any crowd control. They had special constables that you could call up who were voluntarily in terms of trying to police a crowd. But there's no police force as such. In this period, which is just after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there's still a fear amongst the elites, amongst the government. It's a Tory government, fearful of revolution. We're not that far from the French Revolution in the 1790s. There's a fear about democracy, the power of the crowd. Peterloo is the culmination of that. There'd been a big series of meetings, demonstrations, the rise of the modern demonstration, basically, with speakers on a stage and thousands of people on an open space. It might be a field, it might be a building ground, anywhere that's available. And the magistrates really feel that this is the point where they have to clamp down on this type of action. They send in, firstly, the yeomanry cavalry, who are, again, volunteer military. They're not trained properly in crowd control, and they mess up, they get stuck. The magistrates then send in the regular hussars, the regular military, to rescue them. Chaos ensues. Around 18 people are killed. 750 odd we know of are injured. this is seen as a crisis point, not just in terms of the authority of the political elites, but also in terms of how these new industrial cities that are full of thousands and thousands of people now are being policed. The police are introduced from 1829 onwards in London, 1839 onwards in the rest of the UK. And there is increasing awareness that there needs to be much more regular public order policing. Now Britain's urbanised. There's larger concentrations of people in city centres that need to be managed. So Peterloo is the kind of turning point for that realisation that policing disorder is now much more on a mass scale.
I have a very quick tangent though. I don't know if this will actually make it into the podcast, but it's really interesting that the police emerges in line with urbanisation and at the same time as mass enclosure. Is there a significance that the police were another attempt at quelling that disorder rather than actually improving the situation?
Dan Hancock's book on crowds called Multitudes is good on this. He talks about how the police are influenced by crowd theory and how they see the crowd. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think the police are mainly there to stop crime more than disorder. And that's what the early Victorians are obsessed with, crime in back alleys of Victorian London. In rural societies, it's a lot more face-to-face. The magistrate will know who the local labourers are who are employed by the lord of the manor, and the vicar will know who's not coming to church. When you see rural disorder like the Swing Riots, that's why they have to disguise themselves and go from village to village, because when you're in a big city, it's easier to be anonymous.
Would you describe the Swing Riots quickly?
Yeah, so the Swing Riots happened in the early 1830s. They're basically the agricultural equivalent of the Luddites. They break machinery, particularly steam machinery, threshing machines that come in, again, as part of the agricultural revolution to improve agriculture, make it much more mass scale. And they target particular farmers who they know are introducing this new machinery. It's quite widespread across the south of England, also reaches up into the north as well. Again, the government are fearful that this is something to do with the French, because the French have had yet another revolution, and they are thinking about democracy. It's the same time as the first Reform Act is being passed, so there is a growing movement to get more people to vote. But essentially it's about economic deprivation, the fact that the lowest of the labouring classes in agricultural society are losing out from the agricultural revolution and enclosure.
Some years ago, we had a promenade play that a series of volunteers in the museum put on, all about the Swing Riots, and it was called, I think, Performing Protest. It was slightly terrifying, actually. They focused in on the tale of William Winterbourne, who was eventually hung at Reading Jail for his part in the Swing Riot. A huge number of people were also transported. I'm assuming in the aftermath of the Peterloo massacre, similar things happened to some of the people involved. Could you give us a quick summary of that?
So there's a big clampdown on the right to protest after Peterloo. Even though there is moral outrage about how many people were killed and injured in Manchester, the main leaders of the local radical society are arrested and put in jail. Henry Hunt, who's the national speaker, is a Wiltshire gentleman. He's quite well-to-do, but he's the person that you want on your stage if you want someone to address the crowd. He gets arrested and put in jail for 18 months or so. The government also pass a lot of legislation around specifically this type of protest. So they pass the 6 Acts, which are restricting the right to protest, a lot more restrictions on what you can print, censorship, that kind of thing. And it really does clamp down the agitation around the democratic movement. For at least a decade, it becomes quite dangerous to have any sort of demonstration that's seen to be about reform and the vote.
I want to jump right forward now to the 20th century and think about some of the cracking down on public order that happens. So this is building on the back of a fairly long and established history by that stage of police involved in policing particular protests and moments of resistance. I assume that some of those things are happening in some of the spaces that we talked about last time that have been created for leisure and for space within urban environments, public parks, things like that. There's a perfect gathering grounds for large groups of protesters to kick up and riot. What's happening in terms of legislation in the early 20th century to try and control what people are able to do in terms of protest and in terms of public action?
What we now know as public order legislation really crystallises in the 1930s. It's an urban phenomenon. The government becomes very concerned about fascists and communists and unemployed workers and trade unions protesting en masse and particularly marching. So the 1936 Public Order Act is the first piece of legislation that is a general piece of legislation around the right to protest. It's specifically aimed at trying to control the fascist marches that happened in the East End, which culminated with the Battle of Cable Street in October 1936. So the legislation comes in quite quickly. It's pushed through Parliament in response to that. But the government are also concerned about these hunger marches, the Jarrow March and the other national hunger marches that are organised by the unemployed movement, trying to protest against the economic depression that's hit industrial regions very severely in the 1930s. The government are also concerned about communists and anarchists and all these other ists and isms that emerge in this interwar period.
But not the French.
Yeah, we're not bothered about the French. It's the Germans now we've got to worry about. So public order legislation really is a 20th century specific phenomenon, but the 1936 legislation is directly about the right to march and that trying to not quite restrict it, but at least regulate the ways in which you organise a march, that you have to get more permissions from the authorities, that the Home Secretary might have the right to ban a march if it's seen as enabling the breaches of the peace. It's not actually about demonstrations that are static, so there isn't as much restriction legislatively on the big demonstrations that you might see. They're more concerned about people marching in the 1930s.
And a little bit earlier than that, in relation to women's suffrage, is there some degree of legislation that comes in specifically to govern that, or are they dealt with on a sort of incident by incident basis?
The suffragettes, certainly the militant elements of the women's suffrage movement cause authorities lots of problems. They're quite keen on making themselves a nuisance. The main way in which women's suffrage campaigners are policed is through common law of nuisance and through police trying to move them on. They accuse them of being an obstruction in the street. But what they become concerned about is heckling, and the suffragettes heckle some of Winston Churchill's election campaign meetings. They go into the meetings and start shouting. There is a Public Meeting Act passed in 1908, I think, which is about restricting who can go into an election meeting and stopping the suffragettes from heckling the candidates. But it's not really until the 1930s that we see much more general legislation around public order.
So we're jumping all over the place in terms of chronology and time period, but I think some of this sets the scene for maybe a conversation about what's happening in the later half of the 20th century in relation to public protest and the ways in which the police and the authorities attempt to control that, but not necessarily quite the same in terms of the reasons for those protests. I think you obviously have the rise of the environmental movement, the women's peace camp at Greenham Common. You've got lots of different interconnected strands and interconnected communities who I guess are, in a way, a kind of distributed commons, aren't they? They're a kind of set of different peoples who are pushing back against authority and maybe trying to take back, whether it's a mythical commons or not, some degree of control. I wonder whether you could reflect a little bit on maybe some of those different strands of protest, where are they emerging from, and how are authorities trying to sort of crack down on those? And are there particular key moments there in the later 20th century that some of this comes to the fore?
Yeah. In the early 20th century, we kind of knew what protesters were about. They were about isms and ists, the ideologies, which were political, and they were generally organised like political parties or like trade unions. In the middle of the 20th century, from the 1960s in particular, we see new social movements, which are a lot more global, a lot more outward-looking in terms of thinking about the environment. As you said, a lot more environmental awareness, a lot more concern about global issues. Also, a lot less coherent in the way that they're organised. So they deliberately don't want to be organised like a political party or like a trade union. They want to be more network-based and communications-based. So from the 60s onwards, we see the rise of feminist movements, black rights movements, environmental movements. I like the geographer Doreen Massey looked at these, and I liked her way of looking at them as both local and global at the same time. They link really local protests around local spaces to more global issues or global networks. They use different types of protest as well from traditional protesters. So they're very fond in the 1960s of sit-ins and sitting down in spaces. A lot of the squares in central London, around embassies, around nuclear installations. Greenham Common obviously is the most famous, but around most of the developments around the Cold War that are emerging in Britain in the 1960s onwards, you get these camps and protesters sitting down and trying non-violent direct action around these issues. There are some key clashes in the 1960s, thinking about the battles over Grosvenor Square, which is in front of the American Embassy in London in the 1960s, where the anti-Vietnam War campaigners and various factions of the left are using direct action to try and campaign against war. But there's also the growth of the environmental movement from the 1970s. But we also have the rise of alternative societies and communities in tandem with that. And sometimes they're connected, sometimes they're not. So from the 1970s onwards, we see rise of what were then called nomadic communities, travel communities, convoys of caravans of people who wanted to live an alternative lifestyle. Were often denigrated as hippies by politicians and the media, but often just were trying to live off-grid. And they start to become a concern for government and for the right-wing media in particular from the late 1970s onwards. So we see groups that were then called New Age travellers, we call them New Travellers now, and various other communities who weren't living a static lifestyle. They were living more of a nomadic lifestyle. And scholars try to understand this by talking about a sedentarist nomadic binary. So generally, Britain is a sedentarist nation. Doesn't mean we just sit down all the time. Generally, we're based on property. Our law is based on property. How our policing works is based on static property ownership.
This is why in the last episode we were talking about Gypsy and Roma communities and the degree to which they didn't fit with some of those patterns of control of land, of the disruptive use of stopping points in the landscape that perhaps people didn't like. Somehow it just didn't fit with the wider societal norm. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So in a propertied society, people who don't stay in one place don't fit within how society envisages how it's taxed, how it's policed. And that really comes to bear in the 1980s under the Thatcherite Conservative government, which is all about private property. It's about property ownership. We see the right to buy, council tenants encouraged to buy their flats. And it's about protecting particularly a vision of the English countryside, this rural idyll that we spoke about before in the other episode, about a vision of what the English countryside should be, which is propertied people. And those people who don't quite fit these travelling communities didn't fit that regime. The government's also quite concerned about new groups who are starting to emerge within that. Hunt saboteurs, again, are seen as disrupting the traditions of the countryside and the propertied people who live there. Environmental protesters, animal rights protesters, anti-roads protesters. All these people who are on the move, who might not settle in one place, are seen as suspicious. And so that starts to concern certainly the government as a public order issue. They've got other issues of public order that they need to worry about. We've got the miners' strike in 1984-5, issues around football hooliganism, issues around the Troubles in Ireland, which are creating issues around public order in Britain. And those are concerns which are part of the making of the next Public Order Act, 50 years after the 1936 Public Order Act. The 1986 Public Order Act is trying to deal with these new issues around striking miners or football hooligans. But increasingly we see concern in the press, in the media, in politicians' speeches around these new communities, these convoys, as they're called, some of which have emerged after visiting Greenham Common. So the peace convoy emerges after they go to Greenham, talk to the women and then move on. And also it's a challenging of what the national landscape should be. So a lot of the big conflicts happen around Stonehenge or about Stonehenge. And I spoke last time about how in the 19th century you see the development of this idea of national landscapes. And that fits into ideas around national parks, areas of outstanding national beauty, these categories that become statutory. Stonehenge is interesting because it was on private land. And the conflicts over access to Stonehenge start in the 1890s. Private landowner tries to charge people a fee to go and have a look at the stones. It gets donated to the public, but what that actually means is it gets donated to the National Trust, who themselves are a landowner. And there's all sorts of access issues because there's military land nearby, there's still private land around Stonehenge. But with the rise of these convoys, one of the main things they want to do is celebrate the summer solstice at Stonehenge, and that becomes a key battle point each summer around access to this national landscape. Who should Stonehenge belong to? Who should enjoy it? Becomes the big question. Nice middle-class people on a day out to appreciate the antiquarian stones, or should it be druids and other communities who feel some sort of mystical connection to this place, who are asserting the right to access it? So that kind of comes to a head in 1985. The police and the local authorities try and blockade the roads to stop access to Stonehenge around the time of the solstice. And the travelling communities who make their way there end up getting diverted onto a bean field. And we see what's now memorialised as the Battle of the Bean Field, which is a police attack on some travelling communities. Quite a vicious attack if you watch the video footage of it. And that's seen as a kind of, again, quite a key point in this issue of actually new travellers have become a problem of public order, and it leads to the passage of the 1986 Public Order Act, and a lot more provisions in that act around trying to prevent people from accessing sites, giving police more powers to stop convoys of caravans, that kind of thing. So it becomes a kind of moral panic in the mid-1980s around these communities.
So following on from that, we've got this mid-1980s moment. Lots of this seems to be connected in some way to rural spaces and places, even if it's not predominantly rural per se. Then into the 90s, you mentioned the anti-road protests. I think that's when some of this Reclaim the Streets narrative really gets going. We have in the galleries some protest clothing worn by a protester called Jim Hindle, who was at the protests against the Newbury bypass. So along with the protester Swampy, who listeners may have heard of.
Who was Swampy?
Swampy was another protester, an environmental protester, really significant in the 90s. And I think since then as well.
It's called Daniel Hooper.
Yeah. So we've got all of that kind of stuff going on. In parallel with that, I think this is the emergence of rave culture. And again, often these are events that are held out into rural spaces and places, slightly hidden away. Is there something meaningful in the fact that these things are happening outside of urban centres? Is there something important about that continued disruption of the rural idyll? The pushback against authoritarian control of particular spaces, places, routes and highways? Or is this just something that's happening in urban and rural spaces?
I think the ravers and the travelling communities and all the people who are taxing the worries of the Conservative governments at the time are seeing themselves as reclaiming the commons. And they are using those terms. If you look at the imagery that they produce in their drawings and the literature that they produced, the music, it's all drawing from mystical Albion, the Mists and Merlin and Robin Hood, back in the far ages when commons were open to everyone. So it's drawing on that myth of the commons again. And they're deliberately trying to use that imagery to say, look, these places were open to all to celebrate, and then they got enclosed. And now we can't celebrate our customs, our traditions in these places. And obviously a lot of those customs and traditions are made up. These are very young people, quite often people in their 20s, who are deliberately cherry-picking examples of mystical Albion. They certainly attach great significance to a lot of these commons. I think it's significant that the next big incident that happens in 1992 is on Castle Morton Common, one of the largest kind of occupations of a common in history, probably. They reckon about 40,000 people occupied the space in about May 1992 for a week-long rave. So rave culture is intersecting with travelling culture. It's not quite the same, but it is a kind of reclamation of these spaces by mainly young people. And it's also interlinked with the anti-roads movement, who are claiming, again, places like Twyford Down as well. They're claiming the kind of ancient history of those sites to protest against the building of roads and motorways in those areas. It's linking up with other types of environmental protesters and hunt saboteurs, all these different groups, again, that are identified as enemies by the Conservative government and the media. It's interesting that rave becomes the kind of symbol of that. So part of the most famous clause in the 1994 Criminal Justice Bill is around repetitive beats, that you should be able to close down gatherings that you can hear repetitive beats. They're obviously targeting raves there. When I go for a walk around the countryside, I also hear repetitive beats, but it's clay pigeon shooting, or it might be the hooves of horses on the hunt. Or it might just be the motorway
or
in
cars,
the background.
or cars. Yeah.
Or a really well seed drilled field of sugar beet. Repetitive
Well,
beats,
quite.
quite literally.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Damn, that's not making it. One thing, I just want to go back, Katrina. When you mentioned about Robin Hood, I want to talk about Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, because we promised that we would. What was the chronology? Was it that people were inspired by the myths of Albion? You say like the mists of Merlin. I have a very visual image of what that is. And did that then lead to the Robin Hood movie? Or did the Robin Hood movie kind of tap into a feeling? I mean, I know it was an American movie as well. I was looking on, I think IMDb earlier, the featured song is Everything I Do It For You by Bryan Adams, which is not a very English song, but
yeah, this predates you a little bit, Joe, doesn't it?
It does, by 2 years.
I went to see it in the cinema.
Yeah.
You haven't been through that eternal summer where it was number one for weeks and weeks. But yeah, I think it tapped in, to that interest in that kind of fuzzily defined medieval past that isn't quite real, that is all to do with folklore. And I'm also thinking about the Tony Robinson series Maid Marian and Her Merry Men, which was a children's programme at the time. It's all made up. People know it's made up, but it's quite a useful way of using distant past history for your own aims. A lot of the kind of imagery is around the environment, saving the trees. There's another famous tree that was tried to be saved. One of the anti-motorway protests was in Wanstead in East London. They were trying to save an old tree in the middle of a village green. A lot of the imagery of the Newbury Bypass and Twyford Down protested people climbing trees. So there's a lot of an attachment to that idea of living in the forest as some sort of part of our mystical English past as well. So it all fits in that culture of the time, I think.
In Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, obviously, it also features a significant tree. Sycamore Gap features in a sequence, slightly confusingly in the film. It's supposed to be somewhere near the White Cliffs of Dover, which obviously Sycamore Gap was not. It's up
or
on
Sherwood Forest, for that matter.
Yeah, it's up on Hadrian's Wall. So, it's the significant flaws in the narrative there. But
everything else was true.
Powerful myth making.
Yes.
Yeah. Christian Slater's character was, very believable.
Yeah.
Who was it who stole the scene? Who was the sheriff?
Oh, it was Alan Rickman, wasn't it?
Alan Rickman. Yeah.
Yeah.
Greatest performance. Fantastic.
One thing I just want to ask about on the topic of great performances, how significant do you think it is that the myth of the Commons being a myth, that it might not be rooted in historical fact of how it actually worked? We'll come on to this shortly, but even today, it feels like a really powerful driver of how people relate to the space around them. And it, even though it's not based in actual history, it does seem it's based in the history of, I don't know, a history that people want to believe in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think we would have had so much preservation of open spaces if people didn't believe that the land belonged to them as a nation, as a people. So in some ways, it's a good thing that people believed in this idea of a rural idyll that needs to be protected, that has this customary history that's lost in time. Yeah, it's a very powerful myth that still exists today, and I think it does relate to how people identify with what the landscape is. quite often it's a local landscape, but you don't have to believe in the kind of national landscape in a kind of nationalistic way. It's often much more powerful to be attached to a local landscape and your local environment.
There's a really nice example of that, I think, in the book, where you talk about Kennington Park and your encounter with some stones that have been taped off. I think this is during the COVID-19 lockdowns, and I think some of that sense of the importance of local accessible spaces really came to a head during that period. And it was also, of course, just before that moment of the Black Lives Matter protests, when again, certainly in my local park, there were Black Lives Matter gatherings and protests at precisely that moment in summer 2020. Can you tell us a little bit about those taped off stones? Why were they significant? Did they play a part in sparking some of the ideas for the book?
Definitely. So the photograph of the taped off stones was taken by Will Jennings, who's an artist and writer on architecture, because he lives near there. And during lockdown, I couldn't get to Kennington because it's beyond your limit. If you remember, there were limits on how far you could travel. So
Enclosed.
I'm in Croydon in South. Yeah. So he took those and shared them on social media again. And I found them hilarious because it was basically sort of decorative boulders placed kind of near where the allotments are. And the Lambeth Council had taped them off to stop people sitting on them, because it was at a point where you weren't allowed to be sitting down doing nothing in a park. So who would want to sit on a boulder that's quite knobbly? I don't know. It just symbolised a lot of the restrictions that were quite quickly put in place during lockdown over access to open spaces. Kennington was open for people to use, but the other councils had to close, like Victoria Park in East London, I think, had to close because there were too many people trying to access it. So it really exemplified the kind of spatial divisions of access that people have to open spaces, people who live in flats who didn't have access to gardens, for example. I'm mainly a historian of the 19th century democracy movement, and Kennington Common, as it was the site of the big Chartist demonstration in 1848. There's a daguerreotype, which is now in the Royal Collection. Daguerreotype's another type of early photograph, and it's one of the first photographs of a crowd scene that exists, and it's a photograph of this demonstration for the vote. And so I've been involved with the local community, Friends of Kennington Park, for the commemorations in 2018, and I've continued my involvement with them. So I knew Kennington quite well, and it was just a bit annoying that I couldn't get there during the lockdown again. So it just thinking about access to public space, who has access, social, spatial, economic divisions in that was really important. And then that started me thinking about, well, the whole reason that Kennington Common was enclosed was because of that Chartist meeting. The local vicar of the St Mark's next door was sick of these radicals holding huge meetings, causing a big fuss on his local common. So he got a Parliamentary Act, and the park was laid out in 1852, gated off, fenced off. Again, your nice flower pots and your promenading around, but all the things that happened on the common you could no longer do in the park.
Decorative boulders.
Decorative boulders to stop people loitering.
So I guess the lockdowns exposed inequalities in terms of who's able to access space, who's allowed to be in particular spaces. This seems like a sort of fairly familiar theme in terms of all of the different periods we've been jumping around between. We've obviously had a resurgence of interest in right to roam, which you referred to, I think, in the last episode. I wonder whether you could give us a sort of very brief summary of right to roam, and maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the more recent organisations that have emerged in terms of provision of access for people from different communities into rural green spaces.
Yeah, so right to roam emerges quite early in the 1820s. Societies are formed to protect footpaths and the rights of way against enclosure, local landowners fencing them off. And so there is a long history of legal challenges around footpaths, but there's a difference between footpaths and right to roam. There's always been defence of footpaths, but footpaths are quite restrictive. You can only go along a footpath. It is a common right of way, so everyone has that common right. Right to roam is different in that it means you can have open access over all the private property. And that's always been contentious in the commons preservation movement weren't quite in favour of allowing people the right to go everywhere. They're much more in favour of restricting people to footpaths where you can follow the countryside code and not cause any trouble. So it's not until really the 1880s, 1890s that local groups of mainly working class people, particularly in the upland moorlands in northern England, start campaigning for a much wider right to roam. They've seen their local moorland being enclosed, the footpaths being stopped up. So we see mass trespass being used as a tactic from the 1890s. So groups of hikers deliberately roaming across private land that's been shut off to them. And that happens quite a lot in the Pennines and also in the Peak District. So predating the more famous mass trespasses in the 1930s, there's a famous mass trespass in Bolton up Winter Hill in 1896, which has only recently really been re-commemorated. But this is all about sort of actually the people, industrial working class people should have access to the open countryside. It's also reaction against the turning of the moors into playgrounds for gentry and upper class people in terms of grouse moors. So the grouse shooting becomes much more popular in the late 19th century. That entails burning of heather and building of grouse butts. That really reshapes a lot of the Pennines, both southern Pennines and northern Pennines. There's a lot more golf courses in the late 19th century as well. There's a lot of reaction against, again, it's another type of enclosure, is building a golf course, really. You're stopping people going across. I went for a walk the other day and the public footpath went straight across a golf course, and
I've
it is
had that
quite
before.
scary.
It is scary, and there are signs that you need to duck.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like, well, that doesn't feel very leisurely.
Golf courses and grouse moor alike. You don't want to be walking across them at the wrong moment.
One thing that's occurred to me in this conversation, and especially earlier, Ollie, when you mentioned about how urban protest crosses over with the kind of more rural protest that's more in our field, to excuse the pun, it does strike me that we're covering so much ground in these episodes because how we use space and the rights we have for space are just such a hugely pressing issue that recur in so many different facets of our lives. I never would have expected that golf would have come up, and I didn't think we'd be talking about bicycles. But then at the same time, it's like, of course we're going to talk about these things because they're so interlinked with, the access we have to the spaces and how we use them. And yeah, it's just astonishing the breadth of things we've covered, and even like all the things we haven't covered in these episodes. I guess it's so, much like the countryside, it is sprawling the amount of things we could have.
There's a lot more in the book too.
Yeah,
so, we've been jumping around and barely even skimmed the surface of the amazing richness and depth of the book. So thank you for the book, Katrina. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, to find out more, please get the book.
Yeah. So Katrina, what's the book called and when's it coming out?
So my book is called Contested Commons, A History of Protest and Public Space in England. It's published by Reaction Books, and it should be out the 1st of November 2025. And you can pre-order on the Reaction Books website.
And we'll stick a link to that in the show notes.
And maybe we'll finish up with just a brief mention of Katrina made a passing reference to the country code. The country code came about in 1951, the first country code, and in that is a fleeting reference again to not dropping litter. And I think there are connections between litter and the country code and a tangential interest in bins, which we will be hopefully enticing Katrina back to talk about. But I will say no more for now.
Yeah, we're very excited about the possibility of doing this. So
any excuse to talk about bins, basically.
Well, any excuse to talk with Katrina, but also to talk about bins in particular, I think.
Bins and Katrina's like the double whammy. That's awesome.
Yeah, damn.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katrina. It's been amazing talking to you, and I hope you will come back and share more conversations with us in the future.
Definitely. This has been great conversation.
Yeah, it's been a privilege to speak with you, Katrina. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Absolute Units. Your hosts have been me, Joe Vaughan.
And me, Ollie Douglas.
This podcast is made possible by Museums Partnership Reading, our Arts Council funded partnership with Reading Museum.
If you liked the episode, please subscribe, leave ratings, leave reviews. It really helps us reach a wider audience.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next episode.
Will we see them?
We may.
if they listen and then they come in.
You should do that, by the way. We're an actual museum.
We are. Yeah.
We are an actual museum.
And we would love to see you.
Yeah, it's not a bit.
Yeah.
We are a genuine museum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, come visit.
Yeah. We'll be back in your podcast network soon.
Yeah.
Bye.